Did you know something new is invented every 10 minutes? Join us as we speak to the innovators reinventing our world here on planet Earth and far, far beyond. Welcome to GTWN Now, a podcast brought to you by the Global Telecom Women's Network and sponsored by CMS Global. GTWN Now introduces the movers and the makers at the cutting edge of technology who are committed to keeping us all connected. In each episode, we invite a leading expert to share her experience building life-changing inventions in places and spaces that don't yet exist, and the inspiration they must muster to tackle the impossible. We also ask our guests to share tips, tools, and strategies to reach your own moonshot. I'm your host, Rosali Gitau, founder of Bixi FinTech for Women and Global Telecom Women's Network International Board member. Welcome to GTWN Now. Wonderful. Okay. So in today's episode, we are discussing the nuts and bolts of building a digital world right here on Earth. Specifically, we're exploring the concept of digital humanism, whereby digitization is used to strengthen human self-determination, autonomy, and dignity. We'll explore if, how, and why digitization is in the service of humanity and what that future looks like in a landscape of AI. For this episode, we've invited none other than Keri Gilder, Chief Executive Officer of COLT Technology, one of the world's leading companies building the hardware that makes it possible for me to record this podcast in London while you listen to it in Lausanne. From down below laying subterranean cables to up above with cloud hosting, Keri is quite literally laying the groundwork that connects billions of people around the world. Today, we'll talk to her about how she foresees a digitally humanistic world and her plans for the future. So, Keri, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I'm really excited that you are here and that you've accepted this invitation. I want the whole world to know about all of the great things that you do. So maybe you can kick us off by telling us a bit about yourself, what inspired you to do the work that you do? How did you get here? Because that is a part of your story that I think is fascinating. I tell every single woman about it because it's just so inspiring. And you can tell us a bit about that background. And then what digital humanism means to you as you have cultivated and curated this, world-sweeping career.
Yeah, so I'll start a little bit of my background. So I'm a techie by heart. I started out in management information systems, and I was a coder. So I did software development for the first part of my life, and kind of self-taught myself how to be a network engineer, because at the time there wasn't an education, there wasn't a university degree in network engineering, and so I learned how to build networks. And I did that for the first part of my career, building networks for the state of California. I built 5 major nationwide networks for the US government, for many of the service providers, and then went on to move what we call up the technical stack and moved into the IP space and into the what we call the cloud space today, building the actual global internet. So I'm a techie, I'm an engineer, I love tech, I always have. And I was kind of pushed into the business side by an interesting thing that happened. My account manager, I was a sales engineer for Lucent Technologies, and my account manager actually was caught on expense fraud. So they said, you know what, Keri, you're doing it anyway, just move into sales. And it was really scary change, because I didn't see myself as a salesperson. I always saw myself as an engineer, and I moved into it. And that was really the big step, I would say, into understanding business, driving the commercial profile of my career, and then moving up into management. And so over time, long history around building networks as an engineer, or building networks as a vendor on the optical and the IP side for various companies, to ultimately moving over to the UK 11 years ago for a company called Ciena. And I ran Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and that was my first real exposure to global, what I would call global communications, and understanding this humanism that's associated with what I deem the digital universe. And I truly believe it is what connects us all. 5, 6 years ago, I was asked to come over to COLT, and I'd never been on the service provider side. I'd always been an engineer, a consultant, or on the vendor side. But I felt this deep connection to just that, to connecting the world. And I felt that there was this responsibility that I had to make those connections and to break down the barriers around the world for people and for humans to actually have the opportunity to participate in the global economy. And I felt that COLT is a global service provider. It was my opportunity to take my personal mission of connecting people into, into my career space and actually make it happen. And that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years as the CEO of COLT.
That's it. That's amazingly inspiring. um, so digital humanism as connectivity. And I think you really touched on a very interesting point. You were really inspired, not only just connecting the people kind of already who were connected, but you mentioned people who lacked this connection. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more on what your role and or your passion or your pursuit is primarily with people who lack this, because I know that we hear of all of these initiatives around the world to connect everybody, but we know that in this world there's still several
Billions.
hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people who
Yeah.
are not meaningfully connected. So what is your plan to get them online? And what can we all do within the framework of digital humanism for that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? Because the technology has advanced significantly really in the last decade. And we're starting to actually look at technologies that have existed for a long time, but have made great strides in innovation as far as driving, higher levels of bandwidth and higher levels of connectivity, where some of the barriers existed, like weather, don't exist anymore. And I'm specifically talking about low Earth orbit satellite. And although we don't do that at COLT, we partner heavily with those who do. So whether that's Starlink or SES or Nvidia or whoever that is, that last mile access that actually enables people to connect on their phone or on their computer, it's key to create the connections and partnerships to make that happen, because no one company or no one government owns the internet. It is so vast, it's so big, and it's capital intensive. And so there's no way that any one entity can own that. So for us, it's around creating those connections with partners around the world to enable that last mile access. In the case of connecting a lot of the folks that aren't connected today in the rural areas of the world, that is satellite, and it is fixed wireless access. It's these other types of mechanisms, 5G, 4G, that can enable that connection on that very short stint to get from their house to where we are, which is at that first point, to then ride our fiber infrastructure around the world. And I think a lot of things that most people don't know is that if you look at the connectivity, most people think it's on their phone, because that's what people physically connect to. They connect to this wireless device. But that wireless device is actually mostly wired when you actually look at the infrastructure. That wireless device goes to the next satellite, but from there it's actually through fiber that makes that connectivity happen. And even today, at COLT, we have 10 transatlantic subsea cables. And a lot of times that connectivity, if you're crossing continents, is going under the sea.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's this combination and understanding of the right mechanisms in the right place to enable the connectivity to happen. And that right now is possible through all of these various mechanisms. And it's what I call ubiquitous access. Doesn't
Mm.
matter what technology you use, they're all available. It's enabling that capital to be enabled in that particular area. And it's, governments who are building these gig economies to actually make that happen and to subsidize some of that to bring everybody online.
So I'm kind of what I'm hearing from you is like there's everything the technology exists to connect everybody.
Yeah,
So then I would ask, well, what's the hindrance? Why isn't everybody
economic.
connected?
It's economic.
So
It's
what part of
very
it? Yeah.
expensive. It's very expensive to connect, especially rural areas. And yeah, as a fiber provider, I can tell you right now, my business case will never ever prove in to actually build fiber out there. And
Mhm,
so,
mhm,
as a
mhm, mhm.
company, and I have shareholders like everybody else,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
I can't prove the return on investment capital, then I'm not actually going to deploy out there. Whereas a satellite provider, that's a
yeah,
different business case because they
yeah,
have a larger landscape to work from in that rural community, and
yeah,
they're not fully dependent on just that one area being able to, return that investment in that
yeah.
space. And so it comes down to economics.
So we know that, Colt does build this infrastructure to connect the world, and you're saying like the business case for the 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 initial investment in some of these expensive infrastructures aren't there. And you recently announced your own partnership to harness the ability to use space to connect us here on Earth.
Yeah.
How is that? What does connectivity look like then for humans in the next 10 years? Does it look like a breakdown of this business case? Through these type of by leveraging basically space here on Earth. Does it look like more people will be connected? What's your forecast for the next 10 years?
I think more people will be connected. I think that is absolutely possible. However, I also think that governments will need to step in more heavily on the engagement and subsidy of making that happen. Because if you're dependent upon commercial companies that have shareholders and are trying to drive, quarterly revenues and being held accountable for their earnings and their growth on a quarter by quarter basis,
Mm.
it's not possible to do that without some sort of subsidy. I mean, it's really interesting. If you look at the overall landscape globally for service providers, revenue is on a significant decline. And what that is basically telling us, and you look at Omdia, you look at Gartner and Omdia are actually saying that the need for bandwidth is the growth of bandwidth is declining. And they expect that to decline through 2029, 2030, which basically means that, if I'm a service provider like BT here in the UK, the subscriber base that I can make money and revenue off of is pretty much tapped out.
Mhm,
So then
mhm.
how do you actually make money in order to subsidize those areas that still need to be brought into the modern world? It's practically impossible. So this is why we really need governments and we need companies like us to go educate and argue with the EU and with the UK and with, the US to actually enable that subsidy to bring those, areas of the world on. So I think it'll happen, but it's only going to happen when governments wake up to the reality that they're actually going to have to foot part of the bill.
And what's the business pitch for the governments? How much capital are we talking could be unlocked if we connected every single person here on Earth?
It would take billions and billions. It would take billions in order to make it happen. I mean, right now the EU has actually announced for the digital infrastructure, I think 865 million.
Mhm.
If you look at how that is actually happening, if you look at that 865 million, I'm a 2.5 billion revenue company. I put around 500 million in capital investment into fiber infrastructure on a per annum basis, and that doesn't do much to
Yeah.
actually, really cover the ground that you need. So it's billions
Yeah.
that is going to be required. And the reality is, in the next 10 years, there will still be parts of the world that aren't connected because of that.
And the pitch on the other side, which is, if I were a government, if you subsidize this, what is the return? Like, what's the return in unlocking this untapped capital in these unconnected, people? Like, what does that look like? Is
I
it
mean,
billions each?
it's been proven over time, and I
Yeah.
I love some of the cases where in parts of Africa, enablement of wireless devices has actually enabled women in particular
Yeah.
to actually economically be the provider for their family, and actually they are the ones that are creating the
Yeah.
growth of the full economies in those environments. And so what unlocking is education, and you're unlocking this ability to have access to banking,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
environments that, you know this better than anyone, but
Yeah.
it unlocks that ability to actually engage with modern society, which helps to self it helps to enable families to actually self-fund themselves.
Yeah.
So the dependency on government and the government subsidy is less for those families if you're able to unlock the ability for them to actually, have that job, build that company, and actually drive that change on their own, which most people want.
Yeah.
Most people want control of that. They
Yeah.
just don't have the ability to have it.
If you tap into, it's interesting, like, you mentioned, like, oh, this is what i I work on. It's looking at how to untap, how to tap untapped capital, particularly among women. And it's interesting, when you look at the different statistics, it's always grouped into different things. Like, if you untapped women in financial markets, 3 trillion, it would lead to $3 trillion, right? If
Yeah,
you unlocked women in MSMEs, which, for example, if you give them a digital phone, it would unlock like $15 trillion, right? There's all of these pockets, but at the base of it, what you're saying is, but first they need a phone. And I have seen
first they
it.
need a
First,
phone.
first they need that phone, they need that internet. There was this company when I first started my own company, which is, kind of a financial hub for women. I was really inspired by this company in India. And they wanted to become they wanted to become Facebook for women. That was their pitch. We're going to become the Facebook for women. And when the founder, I know her, and she started the company, and it was social media, and people put their profile, and it just morphed into a business platform. Like, every woman on there just started selling
Amazing.
things, because their bandwidth was low, so they were using it as a business tool. And so,
Sure.
long story short, they end up getting a financial license, and they're a bank, and all of these, like, so it kind of embodies the story that you're saying. First they needed a platform, they needed to connect, they needed a platform, and then suddenly they're a bank. And suddenly it's,
Yeah.
and that's the I think that baseline power of connectivity that you mentioned. It's I personally would like to see all of those numbers put together in one big number, because that's an extremely effective business case. So, you'd mentioned one of the gaps to this connectivity that we currently face is the business case.
Yeah.
Are there any other gaps? Because one of the business cases that we hear a lot, particularly from satellite providers, is they meet the business case that they can provide, connectivity at a much more effective cost. Is that true? Is it not realized yet? What's the gap there? Are there any other
The gap
gaps?
there to me is really around the way that satellites work is, they obviously have an orbit around the globe, and
Yeah.
they're constantly on that orbit. That the issue that you have with that is you need a lot of them to cover the entire globe. So even though, the Elon Musks of the world are actually launching, however many, 23, 26 satellites a day, that's not enough to actually cover the geographic
Yeah.
expanse of the world, especially in these rural
Yeah.
environments. And as they're building their businesses, they're of course going to match the longitude or latitude of the economic environment where they can actually make money initially so that they can then, launch into the other areas. And so
Mhm.
I believe it's the business case, two, it's time, and it's making sure that those companies actually can self-fund and to some extent kind of subsidize, the satellites, but it
Mhm.
takes a
Mhm.
while to
Mhm.
get them in because you need a mesh in the sky to
Mhm.
actually have, that environment of full coverage.
Yeah. No, that's so yeah, it's not just a case of the gaps are in the initial investment costs. Like there's still a hint of a tech gap that has to be met if we're to get that cheaper satellite connectivity. Because I definitely get the
Yeah,
impression, particularly in the Philippines, Starlink is quite is there. A lot of people
yeah,
talk about it,
yeah.
but on the ground, when it comes to actually being able to use it, there are a lot of challenges around that.
And it's still very expensive. It's very expensive.
Yeah, comparatively. So I think there's some in having the technology also catch up with it. And everyone's talking about AI, so I have to ask about it. What role does AI play in addressing these gaps? In addressing, can I type in my AI in my chat GPT right now? Can you fix the business case? Or, can you launch me from different places to fix, the connectivity issue with satellites? Like what role can AI play in achieving a world of full connectedness?
I think that's a challenging one because if you look at AI today, the infrastructure that AI requires, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, is
Mm.
enormous.
Mhm.
And so I think AI brings upon some opportunities because it could possibly create, what we're doing in the fiber world which is what we call intent-based networking, where we actually our customers can say, I want to use this route or that route because of secure cybersecurity or because it's a better green path and it uses less carbon.
Mhm.
And we can actually do that today. We offer that as a service to our customers. But those are insights that are provided to the AI is dependent upon data. Then it's the data that's actually derived from to build the insights to then take the best next action. So over
Yeah.
time, could you be in a situation where, hey, we need connectivity here, and you can redirect via AI, satellites, or connectivity to go that direction? Absolutely, that is possible. I think that is
Mhm.
possible. But what we have to realize first is that the infrastructure required for AI requires a lot of power.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's a 160% increase in power requirements over the next 3 years just because of AI. We're already seeing environments like Ireland right now that are, governments that are saying, listen, we can't actually, Google, you can't build that data center because we're already tapped out on the power grid. And so we're not going to allow another data center to be built here. So if the AI data centers have to go where power is not in these rural communities that are lacking internet right now. So I think we have to, sit back and actually say what's required for AI and could that actually be enabled? Today it can't. Today, and I feel very strongly about this. Today it wouldn't be possible because the large language models, require the power. Those are primarily being built in the United States right now. They're not even coming to places like Europe because of the cost of power. Eventually, does that change? I think technology is getting better as far as being less power hungry. But until some pretty monumental changes happen there, I think we're going to be, we're going to have a glut in AI infrastructure in areas of the world.
That is there's your hot take. That's the first time I don't know why that's not on more front pages of publications. Um, that is a
Because I don't
very,
think people are paying attention. It's interesting.
yeah.
We uh we look at this closely because
Yeah.
we're the largest, business to business fiber provider in Europe. And so we provide most of the connectivity that travels across the continent. And we also provide most of the connectivity that travels between continents or lands on our continent and then, and then travels around. So we know what happens, and we've had partnerships with the hyperscalers. We've co-built fiber with them, and we watch this, very closely. And what we're seeing is that only 4% of the overall AI spend to date, capital to date that's been invested, has actually come to Europe. Only 6% has gone to Asia. So the majority of the money that's associated with AI to date is in the United States. And there's two reasons because of that. One is you have to seek cheap power. Two, you have to have power available in order to build the training, the large language models that are doing the training. And AI doesn't have to live anywhere. It's a technology that can live anywhere. And so that's kind of the look at it. But there's so much hype around AI and there's so much conversation that
Mm.
everybody just thinks, and this is governments included, they just think it's happening where they are because there's so much discussion around it. But if you look at the data and the detail, it's actually not. It's happening primarily in North America.
Wow. And is power, I mean, is power infinitely available in
That's
North
for
America or anywhere for that matter? I feel like this is reminiscent of conversations that was happening when blockchain was kind of peaking, right? Like it
yeah.
takes a lot of and that conversation has been somewhat sidelined. We know that a number of the centers started moving towards colder climates. Is this a similar conversation, or are you positing that actually?
It's very similar to crypto mining. The
Okay.
requirements, it's a good parallel actually because it is very, very similar. The amount of power that's required is it's enormous. Um, because if you think about it, the language model is learning, right? So as it's learning, it's
Yes.
creating
It's
more
yes, yes, yes.
compute and it's spinning those hard drives. And so as it's doing that, it's just the brain never stops. And if the brain never stops, then the power that it's consuming to actually, do the thinking is going to continue to expand as it learns. And so that's exactly what's happening.
I feel like this conversation needs to be happening in conjunction with Yuval Harari. Have you read his latest book, Nexus?
I haven't. No, I will check that out for sure.
I'm reading it right now, and there's one chapter on the difference between organic and non-organic matter. And in organic matter, no matter what it is, whether it's a human or an apple, it goes through periods of rest and periods of activity. And if there's too much activity, it will collapse and die. Whereas inorganic matter, it never stops, which is what you're
Never
just
stop.
describing. It never stops. And at one point, a decision has to be made as to whether the organic activity follows the lead of the inorganic activity or vice versa. And the prime example he uses is like in a stock market. If we start using AI for stock markets used to be organized in a way for organic matter, closed on the weekends, open
Yeah.
from, 10 to 5, 10 or 9 to 4. And if the AIs never stop, then does that mean we have to kind of follow suit? Really, that's such an
It's
interesting
possible.
point. Yeah, and it's such an interesting point that you just, brought up about the cost of energy for all of these endeavors, not just with AI, but when we're looking at, you know, adding AI as AI plus this industry or AI plus this, it's the power required for it. And then it begs the question of, can any of this power is this power infinitely available, and can any of it be green, or are we once again falling into the same trap of like, no, it's never going to be green? And
This is the, it's big on my mind right now because COLT is leading, and because of this, exactly because of this, about 4 years ago, we made a decision that we were we were going to be sustainable by design. And we made some big decisions that hadn't been made in our industry in the past of actually not making the business case proven, of ripping out some legacy equipment that actually was taking significant amount of power and space. And we did it proactively, even though the business case didn't make sense,
Yeah,
from
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah, yeah,
economic perspective. What we're seeing now is because we did that,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
we actually, we're more efficient as a
yeah.
company because we're not drawing as much power when power is quite expensive. And so that's actually helping in our, in our value proposition now. And it wasn't the intent initially. We just felt that it was the right thing to do. But
Mm-hmm,
they do go hand in hand. Operational efficiency and being green can
mm-hmm.
actually map and can go together. The problem that we see now is exactly that, though. There is not enough power. And I think this is why you're seeing certain companies like Microsoft has now announced a partnership, in the United States there around nuclear. And one
I
of the
was just
legacy.
instantly, my mind was going to, does this mean France is suddenly going to become a hub of AI data centers? Things like, yeah, that's where yeah,
Correct.
yeah.
Yep, and that's exactly what's happening. And so, you kind of have to put two and two together and start looking at, looking at those scenarios, because if AI grows to the predicted level that it's going to grow to, then even in the US, the public grid will not be sufficient. And so then you have to make a choice. Do you actually choose to have heating and electricity and running your stove and have hot water, or do you run your AI platform? And so I think we're going to see a dissection
Mm,
in how governments and more so companies start thinking about power. And then also, I hope part of this is they start thinking about green power, because that's going to
yeah.
be essential as we go forward. And we just did a partnership, a very strange partnership, but one that we're very proud of, with a company called Arctic Arts, because what we're trying to figure out is what's really happening. And we want to make sure that there's, in our industry, we're not greenwashing and just
Yes, yes, yes.
creating carbon credits that actually at the end of the day aren't doing the planet any good. And so we partnered with a company called Arctic Arts, and they've been going up to a place up in the Arctic called Svalbard, and it's actually increasing in temperature by 7 degrees more than anywhere else in the rest of the world. So it's a bit of a canary in a coal mine.
Mm,
And through their research, through their science, through their beautiful photography, they've been able to come back and say, this is what's happening.
mhm,
And if you
mhm.
match that with what's happening in the tech world, in my world, with this, draw for power, this draw um, for, carbon, it's a draw for carbon, right? Because at the end of the day, you're increasing power, which is actually increasing the carbon footprint, in the world.
Yeah.
Then, you know, it helps you to understand the impact that you're having on the planet as you're making these decisions. And for us, it's critical that we're making the right decisions and that we're leading the way as that sustainable by design and company that is taking the green path, and enabling our customers to take green
Yeah.
paths and make better decisions, towards the planet as they start to build out their digital infrastructures.
It's so interesting that our conversation, I was just writing like a thought, like where this conversation has gone. We talked about first connect, like humanism. What does it mean to harness the power of digital to help us as human beings? And then we talked about connectivity and how that's the vision. But then it ultimately became a conversation about power. And I know that we use the word power in its literal sense, but then
Is
you were very much evoking about, the stat you mentioned about how AI is only, and this need for power is only happening 2%, 4% in other places. And it's happening the vast majority, over 90% in one place. So the literal term for power then becomes the analogous term for power. And what a fascinating, how we ended up like versus humanism and then connectivity. Now we're having a conversation about power, not to become Marxian about all of our, all of our
Sure.
relations and power relations. But I mean, is this kind of coming down to, so maybe I just want to flip it before, things get a bit too cynical and, or hopefully, I don't want the listeners to ever think that,
We
oh, everything's
start talking about a dystopian future. Yes.
the Matrix. No, no, we're going to spin this all around. Like, how can we how can we contribute to less of a power struggle in our conversation about digital humanism and more, I think, is more aligned with where you were heading, which is like a more equitable distribution of power, whether it's, equitable connectivity or equitable distribution of the economic impact of that connectivity. How can we get there? Like, what are three things we can actually do individually and collectively to get there? And I'm not talking about, oh, stop using plastic bags, but you have the perspective of an industry leader working in a very large industry. Like, what are three top line things that you would suggest doing today, speaking to whatever the audience is, be it a government, other companies, COP20, like what do we do today to remedy this power destabilization that threatens to become much wider over the next 10 years?
And first, I think no one company, no individual is going to solve this problem. It takes a collective. So the first thing I would say is join the community of experts to listen, learn, and understand what these impacts can be and are, so that then you can take that back to your respective organization, to your family even, and then you can understand, okay, what are those small changes and those small habits that I have on a daily basis that I can start to change that actually over time do have an impact. And so one example for COLT is that we're now a participant in the UN Global Compact, and it's voluntary. We're not required to participate in that, but it is based upon CEO commitments to implement universal sustainability principles and take those steps to support the UN goals. And that community is important. It's connecting the right people together because we all don't have the answers, to learn from each other, to listen from each other, and then be able to take the actions that are appropriate for you, for your company, for your country. And so I think first and foremost, it's, get involved in the community. The second thing I would say is get is you need to open your mind to doing things differently. And I think that's very, very hard to do. It's changing habits. And I did a talk at DTWS TM Forum a couple of years ago, and I talked about the impact of the paper towel and how if we were in the US and we just reduced our usage of a paper towel by one roll a week, that we would actually, almost reduce 30% of the rubbish, and the because that's number one rubbish in the United States. And then, obviously there's an associated carbon impact with that. But you have to think about it, and it's not easy. And so, it's taking the hard path on changing some habits and being willing to do it. It's almost my friend Keri at Arctic Arcs actually said, in order to change, you have to love it. And I believe that. Like, I love the planet that I live on. I love nature. And when I see it, maybe it's because I grew up in the mountains of Colorado, I want to protect it. And you're only going to change if you love something and you believe it's worth your time and energy to actually make that change. So the second thing I would say is love the planet, because if you love it, you'll make different decisions, both personally and professionally. So maybe it's not three things, but maybe there's two things that I would say, you need to do. And then the last thing is, at the end of the day, we talked about, humans and the digital world and the effect on it. I think that it's all about connecting. It is connecting. It's making these connections between people and the planet and our portfolios, and making sure that there is some harmony that happens between the three. Because if there's not harmony between those three, then at the end of the day, we will start to see destruction in one of them, whether it's people, planet, or the value that we bring in our portfolio. And so I don't think we can create a world where people don't matter, the planet doesn't matter, and our portfolio doesn't matter to, the growth of our businesses, to be able to make the changes that we need to make, and to be able to connect the people around the world that still need to be connected.
That's a lot to digest, Keri, but those were that very well received. I can see that you've given a lot of thought to this, that you are advocating for it quite passionately. And I really hope that people hear that and follow your guidance and advice. And I personally am getting rid of the paper towels. I'm not kidding.
Good.
I didn't even think about that. I'm not a big paper towel user, just, so everybody knows I use the tea towel, but occasionally I do. So why not just get rid of it? And there,
Yeah.
one course of
One
action
habit.
has changed from this conversation. So you've changed my mind. I love this. In order to change something, you have to love it. It's a tough one.
It's a tough one.
It's a tough one. A
Yeah.
really, really tough one. But yeah, that's definitely. Now the question is, how do we make people love things? Again, the conversation started with like, oh, how are we going to make a business case? But it's like, more importantly, and I think you really point to something that's even more important. We now know. So in my previous life, I studied economics. Everybody's thinking, oh, everybody makes these rational choice decisions. But the reality is, and we know this now, we've researched this for, 10, 15 years. People make emotional decisions.
Oh yeah.
We're emotive.
100%.
I can hear all the numbers, blah, blah, but if you hit me at the emotional gut, that's where you have me. So I think I'll end with that. In order to change, you have to love it. So let's just make people love the things that are valuable, like the planet, like each other.
Cool.
Maybe that is the essence of digital humanism, leveraging the digital to make us love each other, at the risk of sounding extremely cheesy, but that's a great way for me to end.
I love it. I love it.
I feel uplifted from where we started the journey and where we've ended. I feel really uplifted. So thank you so much for your time, for your thoughts. And I really look forward to hearing from others how they want to contribute to this conversation. I'll do a write-up. I'll enumerate this advice that you've had and spread it around. So thank you so much again, Keri. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Always.
I want to thank our guest for joining today's episode of GTWN Now, and give a big thank you to our sponsors, CMS Global, for making this episode possible. Today's podcast will be available on our website, gtwn.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you'll be notified when new episodes drop. I'm your host, Rasali Gitau, GTWN International Board Member, wishing you a week of wonder.